Hi there. For our first Unpacking the News segment of the semester, we want to focus on one of the big political stories at the intersection of both Texas and U.S. politics right now. The efforts to adopt new congressional maps in Texas and the national political fight that erupted around these efforts, which you may have heard referred to as mid-decade redistricting in the news. Now, we'll tackle the process of redistricting in much more depth later in the semester when we talk about elections. But because the adoption of new congressional maps in Texas has gotten a lot of national media attention, we think it's a good subject for our first Unpacking the News segment. So while some of this is just the luck of timing for us anyway, it's a pretty good subject for our first Unpacking the News segment. It's very rich.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's a lot of things we could point to here. I mean, first, it's just intrinsically important, right? So we'll get into this, but redistricting is really fundamentally about representation. It's also a really good example of American and Texas government and politics interacting with each other in ways that we're going to be returning to just again and again throughout the semester. It also, redistricting intercepts with some of the key concepts and themes from this course that we're introducing this week and in the coming weeks. Concepts like the role of constitutions, republicanism, federalism, polarization, and themes like conflict management, and this idea that we're talking about is federalism as an organizing sort of feature of politics.
It's really front and center.
It is. It's definitely front and center, right? So let's just start with some of the basics to kind of set this up. In particular, what is redistricting? So redistricting is the constitutionally mandated process of redefining geographic boundaries of electoral districts. So those are things like the districts for the U.S. House of Representatives or the state legislature or even the State Board of Education. So generally, this process of redistricting follows the decennial census. That's the count that takes place every 10 years where the federal government counts the number of people in every state, and this is mandated in the Constitution. Now, we do this to account for shifts in the population, and this is to ensure that each district has roughly the same number of constituents, which it helps us to adhere to this one person, one vote principle. So if we live in neighboring districts, the idea is those districts are about the same size. So the process involves creating new maps that reflect the current distribution of the population, both across the states, and then also the distribution of the population within the states.
No, I should also add that, if you were trying to write that down, that's good.
Right.
If you're taking notes, not dissuading anybody from using their method. And, kudos to you if you are actually taking notes, which is great. But at the end of this, unlike what we do in the more formal lecture segments, we'll have some slides with some key definitions. So you'll be able to reference those, flip ahead to them, okay?
Right.
Now, this process that Dr. Blank was describing, really points to one of the key themes in the class, and that's the importance of the U.S. and the state constitutions in defining the structure of government, although here, through the creation of actual structures of representation, that is, congressional districts. Now, what does the Constitution say about this? The U.S. Constitution says that congressional representation shall be reapportioned every 10 years. Now, the enumeration in the Constitution's language on the slide you're looking at is the actual counting of the population, which we now know is the U.S. Census, which takes place every 10 years with some updates in between, but the actual census takes place every 10 years. Now, the state constitution also has provisions related to this process, again, a function of federalism. Now, the Texas Constitution requires the legislature to redistrict Texas House and Senate seats during its first regular session following publication of each census. Now, the thing to note here by way of transition, the Texas Constitution does not say anything about when the legislature shall apportion the state into congressional districts, that is, at the federal level. This brings us to why the recent maps were introduced and passed in between the usual redistricting process that we expect to happen only once a decade after the census. That shall in the Texas Constitution, which you can see on the slide, doesn't leave any options. When you see a shall in a constitution or a law, it means something must happen the way that it's laid out in the document. So while the legislature shall apportion the state into senatorial and representative districts at a specific time, the first regular session after the census, There's no mention of apportionment of congressional districts. So courts have decided it's fair game. This was affirmed in a legal review of a previous mid-decade redistricting in Texas back in 2003. Now, this brings us back to why this has been such a big news story over the last few months. We're going to start with a short analysis video by the Wall Street Journal that will help explain some of these details. Then we'll come back and unpack it on the other side.
This proposed map could decide which party controls the U.S. House of Representatives.
President Trump understands that his majority in the U.S. House is very narrow.
Just a very simple redrawing, we pick up 5 seats.
The Texas map is designed to give Republicans 5 more seats in Congress. Here's a breakdown of those districts that sparked a gerrymandering arms race.
We have got to meet fire with fire.
And how Democrat-controlled California plans to neutralize it.
This is a very rare case of mid-decade redistricting where the parties in power, specifically in this case the Texas Republicans, wants to redraw something that they already had a hand in making.
This is Matthew Klein, an analyst at the nonpartisan Cook Political Report, which tracks elections and campaigns in the U.S.
Currently, there are 25 Republican seats. Democrats hold 12. One of those seats is also vacant. That is a seat that used to be held by a Democrat. So functionally, Democrats have 13 seats to Republicans' 25.
We have the authority, legally, under redistricting law, to draw districts that align with the voter preferences.
Republicans are taking this opportunity to try and draw themselves 5 new seats in Texas. And they're focused on specifically some of the cities, so Austin, Dallas, and Houston. And they're also taking aim at 2 seats in South Texas.
Zooming in on Houston, Democrats currently have 4 seats.
All 4 of those are majority-minority seats based in Houston's heavily diverse inner core. What Republicans had to do here is basically pack as many Democratic voters as they could into 3 seats and make those districts extremely Democratic so that there's an opportunity for a new district to be created elsewhere. The old version of the 9th district would have opted for Kamala Harris by about 44 points, whereas the new version of the 9th district would have gone for Donald Trump by about 15 points.
Actually, shortly after this interview, Republicans introduced a different proposed map that made this district even more in favor of Trump. Republicans are banking on gains that Trump made with Latino voters in 2024, particularly in South Texas.
So the 2 seats that Republicans are targeting in South Texas aren't guaranteed pickups. Republicans have taken the opportunity to make them a little bit more favorable, but if some of these Latino trends end up reverting to maybe the way that they used to vote or even the way that they voted in 2020, these seats might not become all that beneficial to the Republicans.
The Dallas-Fort Worth area currently has 3 Democratic seats. The proposed map splits up the Fort Worth district in Tarrant County.
It ends up gone. It's missing from the new version.
And packs Democrats into 2 districts in Dallas, which allows Republicans to create a solidly red district.
That swings from some of the northern Dallas suburbs out into rural East Texas, which is deeply conservative and would make this seat an almost certain Republican flip. One of the more ambitious aspects of Republicans' proposal is their effort to target one of the Democratic seats in Austin. This is a very fast-growing area. It's very Democratic.
The current map has 2 Democrats representing Austin, but the proposed map packs many of their voters into 1 seat.
It becomes a seat that would have opted for Kamala Harris by more than 50 points. So this is a whopping Democratic seat at this point.
The 35th district goes from solidly blue to a Trump plus 10 district.
It's not entirely implausible that Democrats could put this in play in a more competitive year, but it's also going to be a very, very tall task no matter what.
We are talking about emergency measures to respond to what's happening in Texas, and we will nullify what happens in Texas. We will pick up 5 seats with the consent of the people.
Texas's effort has provoked a Democratic response throughout the country, and there's no place where that's more apparent than in California. A lot of Republicans are already pretty upset with the current congressional map in California, which gives Democrats 43 seats and Republicans 9 seats out of its 52. But there is still room for Democrats to make inroads if they want to. When Gavin Newsom talks about wanting to even the playing field, it seems almost like this map was designed to do exactly that. The most obvious example is the 1st district. What Democrats have done in the new map is essentially connect a lot of that rural area up in Northern California and has connected it down along the very liberal California coast
The proposed map also targets another Northern California district and several seats in Southern California by making them either safely Democratic or more competitive.
There is a long way to go before this map ends up becoming the map that is actually used in the 2026 elections, and a rather tight time frame. One thing that needs to happen is the state legislature needs to approve the map for a special election that voters would then have the opportunity to vote on whether or not they wanted to implement it. And this process really hasn't been done before. So you can almost certainly expect Republicans are going to try and litigate this either to the state courts in California or potentially even to the federal courts, who could end up ruling in their favor.
We have a couple of other states where we'll pick up seats also.
President Donald Trump has already made it pretty clear he doesn't intend to stop at Texas, and he's already started putting pressure on a number of other states to undergo similar processes. In Missouri and Indiana, there are 2 seats that Republicans are looking to take from Democrats. In Florida, it could be around 3, and potentially in Ohio, somewhere between 2 and 3.
New York, with its 26 congressional seats, could also become a potential flashpoint in the redistricting fight.
This is a war. We are at war. And that's why the gloves are off, and I say, bring it on.
At this point, it's not really clear whether or not there's actually time for Democrats in New York to be able to implement a new map. It's certainly possible for 2028, but in terms of the midterm landscape, I think it's a big question mark. A lot of people have talked about the possibility of this turning into sort of a nuclear arms race. We still have a ways to go before we get there, but one thing is clear. We are headed in a trajectory that we have not really seen in the past. This is the most mid-decade redistricting that we've seen take place in one cycle, and I think it's safe to say that the next Congress is going to look fairly polarized. We're probably only at the tip of the iceberg right now in terms of what that potentially could end up looking like.
Okay. So that video does somewhere between a pretty good and a very good job of capturing how the recent legislative fight over redrawing of congressional districts in Texas has been a very contentious and really, potentially a high-stakes battle that's really linked in important ways to national politics. And I say almost very good because I think early they kind of mess up a little bit in identifying parts of Texas. And I'll say, as someone originally from New York, I'm admitted in it, sometimes it's a little far.
Well, and I think the other thing I would add to that is the fact that they're doing this expensive production of this thing, they're trying to get the details right. They've got some counties wrong. They had to make an edit in the beginning
right.
when they tweaked the maps. Very complicated process. So we're not
and that's the thing.
casting aspersions. That video does a good job of connecting a lot of things in a relatively short amount of time, and the graphics are good, but it's hard and it's damn complicated.
I'm not going to sit here and criticize anybody trying to produce a lot of content right now, not in this moment.
I think that's wise.
Okay, so the new map in Texas, which was passed by both houses of the state legislature last week, and will almost certainly be signed into law by the governor. Maybe by the time you read this or see this, it'll already be signed. And it's designed to increase the number of Republican-held seats in the U.S. House of Representatives by as many as 5, as the video made clear. So the ultimate outcome of this, of course, is going to depend on the results of actual elections next year, right? So the primary election scheduled for March, and also the general elections that we'll see in November. Now, we'll come back to this process later in great detail. But for now, what you should know is that Republicans at the national level and in Texas have been really direct and explicit about what their motivations are, right? They're aiming to increase or at the very least maintain their partisan advantage in the U.S. House of Representatives. They want to maintain a majority in that body. So opponents of the new map, which include state Democrats and civil rights groups, have argued that these efforts are, both unconstitutional because of their partisan and racial components. We say it's a partisan and racial gerrymander, which is a term we'll come back to. And they allege that the new districts are diluting the voting power of minority communities, particularly Black and Latino communities in the state, and that the map was drawn to intentionally favor one political party over the other, which is, I think, uncontested at this point.
Yeah, I mean, later in the course, we'll parse a lot of that out. The distinction here is, are you motivated by race or are you motivated by partisanship? Right now, the assumption based on what's been happening in the courts is that if you're motivated solely by partisanship, then it's okay. It's legally okay.
Right.
It's not an ethical judgment.
Right.
And again, put a pin in that. We'll get back to it.
Right. But these are the arguments that are going around that you'll hear. So the efforts by Democrats who are in the minority in both chambers of the Texas legislature, right, in both the House and the Senate, to protest the measure also made a lot of news along the way here. But just as surely as their efforts made this news, it's also certain that eventually the Republican majorities would prevail and pass the new congressional maps. There's really nothing the Democrats could do to stop them. So in the House, Democratic lawmakers left the state to deny the legislature the quorum needed to vote on the new maps, leading to about 2 weeks of legislative stalemate. Now, a quorum is the minimum number of legislators required to be present for the legislature to do its business. So by the Democrats leaving, they denied the House a quorum to do work. In the Senate, Democrats plan to filibuster the bill. It's a term you may have heard of before. We'll come back to it. But a filibuster is just a prolonged speech by a legislator to obstruct the continuation of a legislative process. The Lieutenant Governor, Dan Patrick, and his allies in the Senate were able to use a procedural maneuver to prevent this filibuster from taking place. But look, in the end, this would have only delayed the maps from being passed while the person was willing to kind of continue the filibuster. It wouldn't have stopped it indefinitely. So I think as we kind of get near the end here, let's take a look at a couple more heated moments from the debate in the Texas House that really illustrate the intensity and the intersection of the fight in the legislature with national politics. This first clip is going to be of State Representative Ann Johnson, who's a Democrat from the Houston area.
So let's talk about cowardice and cheats. Because if you knew you could win this next election, you wouldn't be taking this effort to try to steal 5 seats from elected officials that members of color elected to represent them in Washington, D.C. You wouldn't be doing everything you can to take this coalition of diversity and stand up at the mic and say, why are we doing this? Because we can. And you shield your racism with your party, with ignorance and arrogance, to come up here and say, to be honest with you, I haven't read the bill from the other side. To be honest with you, I haven't talked to the lawyers to be bringing this before it. Because you think that people will give you grace on ignorance and arrogance around party because you can't admit that the root of all of this is about racism and power. A power grab, a pure power grab. And so I'm going to ask, don't shake your head, because I'm going to give you a moment to prove what you mean behind that. Because when Donald Trump called Georgia Republicans and said, hey, boys, I need you to steal me almost 12,000 votes. To those men credit, they said, no, sir. We already know what Governor Abbott said. In a few minutes, we're going to find out what y'all say. Vote no on this bill.
Okay, pretty hot.
That's hot.
All right, so now we could unpack that some, but we'll come back. First, let's listen to Republican State Representative Katrina Pearson, who represents a Northeast Texas district that's centered in Rockwall, and while perhaps running a little less hot, but just a little in the clip, and it was a longer speech. Remember, she could be a little less hot. Her side was winning, but nonetheless, pretty sharp language here and pretty direct. And also, like the comments that we played from Representative Johnson, obvious connections not just to what's going on in the chamber, but also what's going on nationally. So let's roll that clip.
Chairman Hunter may not have taken the personal attacks and disrespect personally, but I did. The opposition gets to stand here and grandstand and say pretty much anything that they want, and we're expected to stand here and just take it. You call my voters racist, you call my party racist, but yet we're expected to follow the rules. Well, that double standard ends today. You know, I started out 15 years ago as a concerned citizen, and I became a volunteer activist. I didn't like what I was seeing, so I got involved. The more I learned, the more I dug in, because I was determined to change the trajectory of not just our state, but our country, and I would argue that I did that. From a founding member of the Tea Party movement to fighting on the front lines for President Trump in 2015, long before it was cool, I have traveled all over this country for the better part of a decade, and I can tell you that more and more minority voters are voting their values, not their skin color. And many of them are moving to Texas to escape the blue states because their values have been successfully gerrymandered into suppression. Now, I've heard the accusations that this mid-decade redistricting is going to silence voters and that it misrepresents the population of Texas. But history tells a different story. We are not the first state to do mid-decade redistricting, and we didn't invent the playbook. But who led the way? Blue states, the ones that you all fled to. The very party today crying foul, and the same party that's saying that they want a fair fight is the party that's pushing boys into girls' sports. They say we're diluting the minority districts. They call us racist, but the facts don't match your rhetoric. Texas currently has 0 black CVAP districts, and under the new map, there are 2. Now, I haven't been to 3rd grade in a really long time, but when you go from 0 to 2, that's an increase. Or perhaps you're using liberal logic. I have heard repeatedly that these maps are gerrymandered, but that doesn't fit the narrative either. That's just spin. Because in many parts of the state, the map eliminates gerrymandering. They emphasize compactness in whole counties and whole cities. Political performance isn't just legal, it is fair. And it reflects the voters of the state of Texas. The reality is, the opposition is complaining that we are ungerrymandering the gerrymandering.
Okay, we'll let everybody just cool off for a minute after that fairly hot comparison of views. You know, ultimately that Katrina Pearson clip is probably commensurably
it's pretty hot.
Of commensurable temperature with,
I think so.
with representative. And you know, we should know, we're not fact checking either one of those. We're not, you know, that would take a long time in terms of both speeches. So while we cool off for a minute, for now, we do want to hit the word that you'll hear a lot. It's popped up in our discussion already, and it was kind of we used it as kind of the punchline for Representative Pearson's excerpt, and that's this notion of gerrymandering or gerrymandering. And you'll hear it most often as gerrymandering, I think, in the press, but the guy's name was Elbridge Gerry, but hey, who am I? So, as the slide says, the term has become a quasi-technical term to refer to the manipulation of electoral district boundaries to gain a political advantage for a particular party, group, or candidate, usually some kind of combination of those things. Now, this practice, which can result in very oddly shaped district, aims to increase a party's legislative representation. Now, in response to the Texas effort, a legal challenge has already been filed with more expected to follow. The lawsuit alleges that the mid-decade redistricting is unconstitutional and that the new map violates the Voting Rights Act, which we'll talk about later in the class, by discriminating against minority voters. Now, this legal and political fight over the maps, is going to continue as the state prepares for the 2026 elections. So as we move forward, we're going to want to watch how those court cases develop, and some of that will even happen, I think, while we're all still together here this semester. Now, what are we going to unpack? Now, these clips provide, a very sharp portrayal of polarization, and believe me, when I was going through the debates again in the House and Senate archives, there was a lot of material to choose from, but let's just start at the top. What do you think?
Yeah, I don't envy you. I would say you did that.
Well, it was kind of fun.
Well, I didn't know.
It was time-consuming because there was a lot, but it was
for us,
fun.
it's fun, but it's still a lot. Okay.
Yeah.
So first, at the most fundamental level, what we're seeing here is an example of something that you're going to hear us be talking about a lot this week and really over the next few. And that's this fact that, while the Constitution may seem to provide relatively clear instructions, we're going to enumerate, we're going to redistrict, the interpretation and the practice of those instructions is a whole other story. And politics is a big part of the interpretation and the story that plays out here, right? And I think that's pretty clear. It's also clear that, we need to take into account both the U.S. and Texas constitutions in understanding how the politics of this all arose and how we were even able to kind of get to where we are, right?
Yeah, I mean, the role that both constitutions play in this is a good example of why federalism matters too. And of course, federalism and the Constitution are linked. But it's an interesting thing for you to note, and you'll hear a lot more about this in the next couple of weeks. Now, it manifests in this case as both a legal factor, a kind of a legal institutional factor, and, as you kind of pointed, as a political factor.
Right.
So on the institutional side, the role of the two constitutions in structuring the redistricting effort in Texas, it's a textbook institutional factor. That is, you've got these sets of rules, they overlap, they affect each other, and they shape the conflict and the process. The divided or the distributed authority between national and state governments, creates the opportunity for mid-decade redistricting.
Right.
And this story is, taking place at this very moment at the intersection of state and federal government. Now, politically, there are a lot of politics here. One key focal point, though, is that the head of the executive branch of the federal government, the president, very directly asked the head of the executive branch in Texas, the governor, to call a special session of the legislature. Made it very clear that that's what they wanted. And so the executive is there interacting with the state legislative branch, and in this case, the legislative branch pretty much has to do what the governor says. They have to convene in a special session by Constitution. So, they want the the president wanted the legislature and the governor to use state government power to change the lines of representation in the federal legislature. And this is mainly motivated by, and nobody's made any bones about this, that the president wants to preserve his party's majority in the U.S. House of Representatives in the next election. And, there was footage in the summary we showed where you have that clip of President Trump saying, I think we can get 5 seats. Let's do it.
Right. No, I think that's great. I love the way that you laid that out because it is sort of like, and it can sound super complicated. And in some ways we're doing that on purpose, but also saying, it's not, but it is. And part of it is, and the reason it is because we do have these different levels of government interacting in ways that maybe are not obvious to understand at at the top level.
There's a lot of different boxes with lines with
the lines are going
with the arrow on each the two-headed line, right?
Right, exactly. So the other thing is that, a couple other things that kind of come out of this. I think thinking about the dueling clips that we showed you near the end, this is just a tiny little taste of one consequence of partisan polarization, right? We see extremely heated rhetoric, and not merely about policy, but about the personalities and the intentions of not only the other side, but the other side's voters. We also see very, very different views about basic facts, especially as it has to do with the role of race, ethnicity, in politics. And you may have noticed, that just sort of related to this, that both the Democrat and the Republican in those clips were talking about the preferences and the representation of communities of color. It's really no coincidence here that Texas is a majority-minority state whose population is one of the most diverse and most quickly diversifying in the country. And so both parties, when they're looking forward to the future elections, they're going to require support from no small share of these emergent groups who are going to make up larger and larger shares of the electorate, which is why even though, again, this is sort of directly about representation and it's about moving lines around, this direct sort of, I'm going to say almost communication to these groups is a reflection of the fact that as all these members are looking ahead to further elections, these are the groups who are going to make up at least the plurality, probably the majority of the Texas electorate.
Yeah, and the visuals on that even in those clips and, the terms of the other members that are standing around. And just for those of you that have never seen this, which would be most of you, there's developed an interesting kind of tick in the legislature in the last few sessions where a member goes up to the front to talk and other members that are supporting either their bill, but usually it's their party or the subject at hand, kind of line up behind them to kind of give them moral support.
Show solidarity.
Show solidarity, and also sometimes just to be in the picture, frankly. But that's useful for us, so you can go back and look at those clips and kind of parse, what the speakers look like, what the people behind them, how they're reacting. It's a pretty rich text, if you will. Now, we've deferred a lot of things in here to keep this at a manageable length. Now, if you want to know more about some of the claims about the new congressional maps and the changes that they make to representation with respect to party and to race, we've included a link, a supplemental reading from the Texas Tribune. It'll be on the slides at the end, that looks at this in case you're interested in, drilling down more into some of the claims that are made in these clips and in some of the facts that you'll see in the news. The inevitable question, it's not required reading, but it will help you.
Yeah, help you understand this better.
So either if you're interested or if this all still seems not quite clear to you at this point, which, would be understandable given that we're putting some things off to talk about later, have a look at that. You'll find it helpful. Okay, so that's the first Unpacking the Redistricting news. We'll close out with some of the terms that have come up in the segment. Stay at it, stay working on the class, and keep in touch.